Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Emily Carver. Tonight, we return to New Bedford, Massachusetts, summer and fall of 1988 into 1989, when a string of disappearances and body discoveries along I-195, Route 140, and Route 88 would alarm a city and puzzle investigators for decades. This is the case that came to be called the New Bedford Highway Killer. It's unsolved, and it has haunted families, neighborhoods, and honestly, me, for years. Lewis, I want to start with a scene. Picture a driver pulling off a highway to relieve themselves and finding bones in the brush. That actually happened. It was one of the early discoveries that tipped people off that something far worse than a single missing person was unfolding. This is the case that came to be called the New Bedford Highway Killer. It's unsolved, and it has haunted families, neighborhoods, and honestly, me, for years. Lewis, I want to start with a scene. Picture a driver pulling off a highway to relieve themselves and finding bones in the brush. That actually happened. It was one of the early discoveries that tipped people off that something far worse than a single missing person was unfolding.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Louis Andrade. That image is grim, Emily, but it's accurate to how many of these remains were found, near, on, and off ramps, within yards of the highway. Those scenes are part of what links the cases geographically. Dumps clustered along I-195 through Dartmouth and Marion, then Route 140 into Freetown, and Route 88 in Westport. The pattern is striking, and it tells you something about how the offender, or offenders, moved. It implicates someone familiar with those roads.
Right. And for listeners who haven't followed this, let me be clear. The officially reported count is 9 confirmed homicide victims whose bodies were found, and 2 additional missing women believed to be linked but never recovered. There are also several surviving women who reported similar abduction or assault attempts around that same time. The victims' lives overlapped in heartbreaking ways: addiction, sex work, working-class neighborhoods, and many shared Portuguese heritage. That context matters when we talk about how the investigation unfolded.
Absolutely. New Bedford in the late 1980s was a port city that had seen better days. Industrial decline, rising unemployment, the drug epidemics, heroin and cocaine had real traction in places like Weld Square. That created a visible street-level drug market and a circle of vulnerable women who often traded sex for drugs or money. Those women were the ones the killer targeted, and also the ones most likely to be marginalized by the system that was meant to protect them.
And that marginalization shows up in the record. Families later described feeling dismissed by policewomen, written off as addicts or prostitutes, reports delayed, a lack of urgency. We'll come back to policing and investigative choices in a bit. But first, Lewis, can we walk through some of the victims? We'll treat them with care and focus on who they were, not just how they died.
Yes, we should name them. Starting with Deborah Medeiros, sometimes rendered as Medeiros, identified as in her late 20s and found on July 3, 1988, off Route 140. Her remains were skeletal when discovered. She was ultimately tied to the cluster by position and other circumstances. Then's Nancy Lee Paiva, 36, found July 30, 1988, beside I-195 in Dartmouth. Her body placement was similar to Deborah's, on her back, feet toward the highway, and investigators noted strangulation as likely. Those similarities were chilling to investigators at the time.
Deborah DeMello, listed in some records as Deborah, was found November 8, 1988, off an I-195 eastbound ramp, with clothing scattered in nearby trees. Crucially, some of Nancy Paiva's belongings turned up with DeMello, which linked scenes and suggested the same offender, or at least a connected set of events. Don Mendez was found later in November along the Reed Road ramp, identified by fingerprint from a remaining hand. Each of these names has a family attached: kids, parents, people who kept asking, "What happened to our daughter, our sister?"
And there were more. Deborah Lynn McConnell, a woman from Newport, Rhode Island, was found December 1, 1988, off Route 140 in Freetown. Again, the bra was reportedly wrapped around the neck. Rochelle Dopierella, whose case is notable because she'd stayed with and dated attorney Kenneth Ponte, was found December 10 in a gravel pit off Reed Road. She'd been beaten to death. Different in some ways, but still part of the overall cluster. Robin Rhodes was recovered March 28, 1989, on Route 140. She reportedly wasn't involved in prostitution, but struggled with addiction and knew several other victims.
There's Mary Rose Santos, 26, found March 31, 1989, along Route 88 in Westport. She'd been seen at the old quarterdeck lounge and was represented by Ponte in civil matters. And the last body recovered, Sandra Botello, found April 24, 1989, in Marion along I-195 in a fetal position. That makes 9 discovered victims. Then, 2 women, Christina Montero and Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, are missing and presumed linked. It's important to list them, to give names to the lives cut short or shattered.
Yes. Their shared vulnerabilities, addiction, proximity to certain neighborhoods, contact with sex work and drug circles, create a clear victimology. That, combined with dumping locations close to highways and ramps, suggests a perpetrator who knew those roads, who wasn't afraid to stop in the dark, who might have been driving a vehicle that allowed quick access to remote brush. The recurring features, nude or partially clothed bodies, signs of strangulation, point to a consistent modus operandi in several cases.
Wow, the geography is chilling. Tell listeners more about why those dump sites matter, Lewis.
Okay, so most bodies were within about 25 feet of the highway, often in dense brush or wooded pockets near on and off ramps. Reed Road ramps were especially significant. That suggests the killer relied on the anonymity and convenience of highways, quick stops, places where a car can pull off without drawing attention late at night. It also suggests someone local, or at least someone who drove those routes routinely. Construction, delivery, trucking, or a commuter whose job forced repetition in those areas.
So, local familiarity, yes. We don't want to stereotype jobs, but it's a reasonable investigative inference. The timeline is also important. 1988 into spring 1989. The first discoveries in mid-1988 to late 1988 prompted searches and public concern. But the public reaction was complicated. Nationally, the case never grabbed headlines the way other serial cases did. Locally, newspapers and TV covered it with increasing alarm as bodies accumulated. Families felt that coverage was not sustained, or that it lacked the urgency they expected.
And the law enforcement environment of the time matters. This was pre-CODIS in any usable sense. DNA was in its infancy for criminal cases. There wasn't the robust interagency data sharing we have now, or the forensic tools that later solved other cold cases. Investigators relied on fingerprints, dental records, witness statements, often collected from people in vulnerable situations. Those witnesses were sometimes reluctant, sometimes inconsistent because of addiction. That made building a strong prosecutable case extremely difficult.
Which leads us to suspects and the paths that investigations took. 2 names dominated early inquiries: Kenneth Ponte, and Anthony DeGrazia. Lewis, can you walk through Ponte's profile and why he became a focus?
Sure. Kenneth Charles Ponte was a local defense attorney who represented many people from the drug and sex work circles. He had direct personal connections. He dated Rochelle Dopiarala and had represented Mary Rose Santos. That web of relationships made him visible to investigators. In 1990, he was charged in connection with Dopiarala's death, but prosecutors dropped the charge in 1991, citing insufficient evidence. Years later, investigators even excavated his former driveway and patio looking for remains or signs. Nothing was found. He later fell into poverty. He was arrested in 2009 for shoplifting and died in 2010 at home with no foul play suspected. Ponte is compelling because of proximity and associations, but no forensic evidence tied him conclusively to these crimes.
Right. He was, in some ways, an easy target for suspicion, visible, connected to victims, a local figure, but the evidence didn't hold up. There's a line here I want to draw for listeners. Being a suspect in the press isn't the same as being the perpetrator. The DA's office pursued cases, but charges need to meet a legal standard, and in Ponte's case, that threshold wasn't met. That doesn't erase the pain families feel, though.
No. And the other central figure, Anthony DeGrazia, was a construction worker with a criminal record who was named by at least one survivor as resembling her attacker. The state pursued him aggressively. Authorities sought warrants accusing him of multiple assaults. But his case never produced a murder indictment for the highway victims. Then he died in mid-1990 under controversial circumstances. Found face down beneath a picnic table at his ex-girlfriend's parents' property. Local police called it a homicide initially. The DA later ruled it suicide. The autopsy reportedly listed manner of death as homicide, which has fueled conspiracy talk ever since. But again, no direct forensic link to the highway discoveries became public.
That's one of those moments where the public version and the coroner's details don't line up, and everything becomes murky. Listeners, you'll hear this pattern in many cold cases. Contested deaths, contested motives, contested investigative narratives. Louise, aside from Ponte and DeGrazia, were there other suspects or theories investigators entertained?
Yes. Over time, a variety of local men were interviewed. Truck drivers, known violent criminals, Johns. Names shifted as investigators chased leads. Daniel Tavares Jr. propped up in later conversations because he was a violent offender from the region who allegedly made hints in prison about involvement. But those claims didn't yield evidence. There were even fringe theories tying the New Bedford cluster to crimes in Portugal, the so-called Lisbon Ripper speculation, because of Portuguese diaspora connections. But the Lisbon link is unproven and largely speculative. In short, multiple leads were pursued, but nothing stuck, largely because of the lack of physical evidence and the difficulty of testimony from traumatized or marginalized witnesses.
The investigative picture is also complicated by what the DA's office did and didn't do, and the political context. Ronald Pena was the Bristol County DA who oversaw some of these prosecutions. The pressure to solve a serial killing can push offices to focus intensely on certain suspects, tunnel vision that critics say may have narrowed the scope prematurely. That can leave cold cases with discontinuities when teams change or when higher priorities shift.
That's a good point. Political pressure, the need to show progress, and the spotlight, however local it was, can all distort an investigation. When cases relied heavily on witness statements from people who were using drugs and there were no DNA matches to anchor the evidence, prosecutors were forced to make judgment calls that, in hindsight, may not have produced the right outcomes. It's a structural problem. Limited forensics plus vulnerable witness populations equals a higher bar for convictions.
And the families, some are still alive, have felt a long, cold silence. Maureen Boyle's book, Shallow Graves, which many of you may have read, does a lot to humanize the victims and recount family frustrations. The press cycle hit big moments: bodies discovered, arrests, then quiet. For people left behind, quiet means grief with no answers.
Yes, and that quiet is part of what keeps cases like this haunting. The victims weren't anonymous to their communities. They were daughters and mothers. Many had children who had to grow up without a mother, or parents who waited decades without closure. Those human losses are the ethical center of our work on this podcast. Facts matter, but so do the family's experiences and the long psychological toll.
Before we dig deeper into forensics, Lewis, can you describe the crime scene signatures again, in plain terms? What investigators saw across multiple sites, and why those signs point to a pattern?
Sure. Pattern recognition, in this case, rests on several repeatable observations. Bodies, often nude or partially clothed. Signs of strangulation in multiple victims, including bras found around necks. Body placement close to highways, and sometimes feet oriented toward the road. There were also beats and bruises in at least one case. While one victim, Rochelle, was beaten to death rather than solely strangled, the combination of geography, victimology, and body presentation suggested to investigators a serial offender with a fairly consistent method of disposing of bodies. The breadths of variation don't negate linkage. Serial offenders often vary a bit, but preserve key elements.
And yet, despite that pattern, the physical state of the remains made forensics difficult. That's where we circle back to the late 1980s limitations. There was minimal DNA technology, and many bodies were skeletal when found. Lewis, given the state of evidence then, what could modern techniques bring to a case like this now?
Good question. The cold case DNA revolution, especially genetic genealogy, has changed the game. If preserved biological evidence exists, seminal fluid, blood, tissue trapped in clothing, or DNA on ligatures, modern labs can often extract profiles, even from degraded samples. That DNA can then be compared through CODIS or run through investigative genetic genealogy to find familial matches. But a crucial caveat: we don't publicly know whether usable biological evidence was preserved for these victims. If it was, there's potential. If it wasn't, or if items were discarded, the avenues narrow considerably. Still, there's also metadata now: license plate readers, CCTV, cell phone records that didn't exist then, which could create new leads if historical data or witness recall can be combined in smart ways.
So the possibility for resolution exists, but it depends on whether evidence survived and whether agencies are willing to revisit the case with modern techniques. There have been occasional investigative renewals, digging at Ponte's home in 2009, for example, so there is some ongoing attention, but we can't promise anything. We can, though, outline what solving it might require: re-examination of physical evidence, re-interviewing witnesses with trauma-informed approaches, and genetic genealogy if DNA is available.
Yes, and also better cross-agency coordination. These dump sites span several municipalities. Linking information across city police, state police, and the DA's office is easier now than it was then. Revisiting case files with fresh eyes, looking for connections that were obscured by the fog of the late 1980s investigative environment, could surface overlooked leads. But that requires resources and political will.
I want to pause and remind listeners we'll list the victims' names again at the end of the episode. For now, let's talk about the human stories, little details that remind us these were people with lives, not just case files. Louis, anything that stood out in the reporting you'd like to highlight?
Yes, simple things, like Mary Rose Santos being dropped by her husband near a downtown bus station and later being seen dancing at a lounge, or Deborah Medeiros being last seen after a fight with a boyfriend. Those are ordinary life scenes that turned into tragedy. Families described phone calls that never came, birthdays missed, and children left to grow up in uncertainty. Maureen Boyle's reporting is particularly good at tracing those personal threads, which pushes us to remember why the cold case matters beyond headline stats.
I remember reading about a brother who kept looking for his sister's missing posters in laundromats, and a mother who couldn't understand how the system could be so quiet about multiple disappearances. These are painful images. And for survivors, women who escaped attacks, the trauma is lifelong. They were sometimes among the main witnesses, yet their credibility was often discounted because of stigma. That stigma is a recurring theme for this episode.
Exactly. The war on drugs mentality of the era often framed sex workers and people using drugs as criminals rather than victims, which affected police priorities and public sympathies. You can see parallels with other marginalized groups, like missing and murdered indigenous women, where the state's response is influenced by social prejudice. For a fair investigation, we need to center victims and witnesses, which wasn't always the case in 1988-89.
Right. And that leads us to the politics of prosecution. The DA's choices, like focusing on individual suspects, can be driven by a desire for closure, but can also lead to tunnel vision, as we said. Ponte and DeGrazia both reveal the limits of circumstantial cases. You can build a compelling narrative for a suspect and still not have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Ponte and DeGrazia both reveal the limits of circumstantial cases. You can build a compelling narrative for a suspect and still not have proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
And that's a critical legal principle. Reasonable doubt exists to prevent wrongful convictions, but it also means that some perpetrators remain free if evidence is insufficient. The challenge is balancing vigorous investigation with careful evidentiary standards. In the New Bedford cases, many people believed someone was actively hunting these women. Others thought multiple perpetrators could be responsible. Without DNA or a confession with corroboration, both possibilities remained open.
Multiple perpetrators. That's something listeners keep asking about. Was this one killer or more than one? Louis, what does the pattern say?
The geographic clustering and similar body presentations make a strong case for a single offender or a core perpetrator responsible for most cases. But variation, like Dopirola's beating compared to strangulation in others, doesn't necessarily rule out a single killer. Offenders can escalate or vary in technique. On the other hand, the same geographic environment, highways, drug markets, could have been exploited by different violent men operating independently. The evidence doesn't absolutely resolve that question, which is part of why the case remains so haunting.
We've talked about investigative limits and suspects, but we haven't dug into how this case has lived in culture books, media, and local memory. Louis, you mentioned Carlton Smith's Killing Season and Maureen Boyle's Shallow Graves earlier. How did those shape public understanding?
Smith's Killing Season, published in 1994, was one of the earlier accounts framing the cluster as New England's deadliest unsolved serial killer case. It leaned into sensational elements, which helped elevate public awareness, but sometimes simplified complexities. Boyle's Shallow Graves, published in 2017, takes a different tack. It's more methodical, victim-centered, and critical of investigative missteps. Boyle's work revived attention, gave families a respectful voice, and mapped the long emotional toll on survivors. Local newspapers and anniversary pieces continued to keep the story alive in the region, but nationally it's remained relatively obscure compared to high-profile serial cases.
And the case's cultural afterlife includes internet forums and sleuthing communities that speculate, some constructively, others less so. There are comparisons to other highway killers, the Long Island serial killer, for instance, but we have to be careful about drawing direct parallels. Each case has its own specifics. Louise, any final thought on the cultural dimension?
Just this. Cultural retellings can be a double-edged sword. They can keep cases in the public eye and spur new tips or resources, but they can also resurrect unhelpful speculation that harms families or misleads investigations. The most constructive media work centers victims, highlights facts, and encourages people with credible information to contact authorities, rather than simply amplifying rumor.
That's a good segue to what listeners can do. If anyone out there has credible, specific information related to these cases, contact the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit or the Bristol County DA's office. We'll include contact info in the show notes. This isn't about armchair sleuthing. It's about getting evidence to the right investigators. Louis, before we close, let's walk through a concise timeline so listeners can hold the chronology in mind.
Okay. Broad strokes. March-April 1988, some disappearances begin. Late spring into summer 1988, several women vanish. Deborah Medeiros, Nancy Paiva, Deborah DeMello, Mary Rose Santos among them. By late summer and into fall 1988, more bodies are discovered. November and December 1988 see multiple recoveries, which prompted state searches and rising public fear. Then, in 1989, additional bodies are found. Robin Rhodes in March, Mary Rose Santos end of March, and Sandra Botello in April. By April 1989, the aggregation of discoveries convinced authorities and the public that there was likely a serial offender. Missing from that list are Christina Montero and Marilyn Cardoza Roberts, who were never found.
Thank you. And we can't ignore the ways this case intersects with late 1980s social conditions. The war on drugs, the decline of manufacturing towns like New Bedford, and the stigmatization of sex work communities. Those contexts didn't cause the murders, but they shaped who was vulnerable and how the police reacted. Louis, any closing thoughts on what justice might look like here?
Justice in a cold case can mean different things. A conviction, sure, but it can also mean giving families answers, a named perpetrator, a credible explanation for why and how, so that survivors can close a chapter. Practically, justice would require reinvestment, re-examining evidence with modern DNA techniques if available, re-interviewing witnesses with trauma-informed practices, and sustained cross-agency collaboration. It would also mean acknowledging past investigative shortcomings and centering victims in any renewed work.
That's exactly the somber, reflective tone we wanted to hold tonight. Before we go, Louis, I want to read the names, quietly, respectfully. I'll speak them, and I'd like you to listen with me. Deborah Medeiros, Nancy Lee Paiva, Deborah Greenlaw DeMello, Dawn Mendez, Deborah Lynn McConnell, Rochelle Clifford Dopiera, Robin Lynn Rhodes, Mary Rose Santos, Sandra Botello, Christina Montero, Marilyn Cardoza Roberts. These were people. They had families. They had histories beyond the headlines.
We say their names to honor them and to remind listeners that cold cases are about living people, not just mysteries. If you have credible information, again, reach out to the Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit or the Bristol County DA. And if you're in New Bedford or have family ties there, remember the social context, how economic decline and the drug crises made people vulnerable. That context is part of the story, but it also points to how we might do better in the future.
Thank you, Lewis. For our listeners, if you want further reading, Maureen Boyle's Shallow Graves is a careful, empathetic account, and Carlton Smith's Killing Season is an earlier, more sensational take that shaped public perception in the 1990s. We sourced our facts tonight from those works, regional reporting, and archival sources. This case remains unsolved, and that's the point of Still Unanswered. Some stories persist because justice hasn't been served. We'll keep bringing these stories back into the light with respect and rigor.
Yes, and if you're listening and feeling unsettled, that's an appropriate response. These cases are meant to unsettle. They remind us of how fragile safety can be for some members of our communities, and how social stigma can lengthen the path to truth. Keep asking questions, and if you've got concrete information, pass it along to law enforcement. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Lewis. That's it for tonight's episode of Still Unanswered. We'll keep tracking developments and following any credible leads. If you appreciated this episode, please consider supporting investigative reporting and victim-centered journalism. And finally, rest now. Deborah, Nancy, Deborah, Dawn, Deborah, Rochelle, Robin, Mary Rose, Sandra, Christina, Marilyn, you are not forgotten. We'll be back next week.